by reminding us, you and me, that we are data subjects, that we have these rights. We have personal data that needs protecting. Don't sort of stick a pin in a board and decide, well, that's the career for me. You've got to have some interest in it. I got interested in it and I started talking about it. I started writing about it. I started a blog. That if you apply a sort of personal data aspect to that, that could be pretty catastrophic. It's one of those areas I really struggle to predict how it will develop because the technology is developing at such a pace. A certain number of names made a right to be forgotten request to OpenAI. It could collapse the whole thing. Some researchers or journalists, I'm not sure, discovered that if you asked ChatGPT.
Hello, hello, and welcome to the latest edition of But Is It Legal, the podcast from TBD Marketing. I'm your host, Simon Marshall. I hope you know that by now. Otherwise, welcome if this is your first episode ever. Today, I'm joined by Jon Baines, who is a senior data protection specialist at Mishcon de Reya. John, you say hello.
Hello.
Good to meet you. Thanks for agreeing to make some time for us today as well. John, are you able to tell us a bit about how did you get into data protection in the first place, data protection privacy, and then what led from there into working for Mishcon?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for inviting me, Si. It's uh, it's really been interesting seeing the sort of stuff that you've been doing on LinkedIn in recent months, and you and I have been talking quite a bit. So it's great to be doing it in a. It's not a formal setting at all. It's an informal one, but at least it's a kind of professional one. So unsurprisingly, and probably like most of my peers, I didn't decide one day that I'm going to have a career in data protection and privacy and information rights. Um, if we rewind half of my life, at that stage, I thought I was going to be an academic studying literature and philosophy, but that didn't pay the bills. I needed something that did. I ended up working in a legal department in a local authority.
Right.
And one day my boss said, there's this new thing called the Freedom of Information Act coming in, and we need someone to learn what it's about and what it means for us. And so I sat down with a copy of the act and uh, some of the guidance and boned up on it and helped the local authority prepare for it. And then a year or so later, my boss said, there's also this thing called the Data Protection Act, which has been around for a while, but no one here knows about it. Can you learn about that? And I did. The two bits of law, as anyone knows them, are interrelated.
Of
Um,
course.
I should stress at this point, I wasn't a solicitor, and I'm still not.
Right.
And I say that partly for information, partly to make sure that our head of compliance doesn't tell me off, because we like to make clear that I am not a lawyer. Um, so I stayed at the local authority for quite some time. I just got really interested in it. I found the topic very interesting. Um, I think that information rights is the sort of banner I work under, if you like. And so that's about accessing information and broadly about our rights in respect of our own information and others' obligations in respect of our rights and our information. Just found it really interesting. I started talking about it. You know me, so once you start me, I won't stop. I got interested in it and I started talking about it. I started writing about it. I started a blog, and these were the early days. By now, it's the early days of Twitter. I got very active on Twitter. Um, I, I then got a job working as Freedom of Information Manager and then Data Protection Officer at Network Rail.
Right.
So still public sector, really. Um, and then I got contacted by one of the partners at Mishcon de Reya, who was just interested in what I was talking about. Um, I, I'd met him for about 30 seconds at a conference, but other than that, our interactions were purely through social media.
Right.
And we had lunch, and fast forward a year to 2018, I took up a role at Mishcon as a subject matter expert doing fee earning work, but a little bit of support work as well for the firm in data protection, freedom of information, and related stuff. So that's how I got to Mishcon. So very much a sideways move, um, but perhaps one that's slightly less unusual these days than it was 6 years ago.
How do people at the firm know to kind of find you within the firm? I think we have these hierarchies for lawyers that are very clear. Is it easy being somebody who's not a lawyer at the firm, but is a subject matter expert?
Yeah, I mean, I've found it very easy at Mishcon.
Right.
There's one thing I won't draw a comparison, although I've just said my two previous employers, but the lawyers in a shiny London law firm are much more respectful of my position and
Mm.
my expertise than were lawyers in other jobs that I've had. Um, and so that's a tremendous help, because I very much feel that I'm not in a hierarchy. I don't want to pretend there isn't one. There are obviously senior partners, and even within the
Mm.
partnership, there are particularly senior and important partners. Um, but on a one-to-one, I never feel that I'm in a real hierarchical situation. So how do people find me? I mean, again, I like to talk about what I do,
Right.
and one part of my role is dissemination of information, being a sort of part knowledge lawyer within the firm. So I'm always setting up groups, and whether that's email groups or on Teams, and but it is still a challenge, that internal uh, networking. And as a firm gets bigger, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but Mishcon's not far short of being twice the size it was when I joined.
Right.
It gets increasingly difficult to cover
Mm.
everything, but I try my best.
What are the advantages of working at a law firm, though? I mean, if you were, what are the advantages of working at a law firm? Simple as that.
I So the real advantage for me is the sheer diversity of work.
Mm.
Um, I think that's assisted by the fact that Mishcon, and its idiosyncrasies, it's quite diverse client base. The fact that it's full service means that I'm always doing different things, and I'm encouraged to. Um, so I'll do non-contentious compliance consultancy sort of stuff. I'll do contentious disputes work. I'll work on corporate deals. I'll advise employment clients,
Right.
real estate. I do quite a lot with our real estate litigators, which is really interesting because I think until I was there, there probably wasn't that overlap with the two practice areas. Um, so I think that's the real benefit to me, is just the real sort of intellectual stimulation I get from doing such a diverse range of matters.
Sounds like a varied day then, every day. It's not as if your day's the same any day when you're coming into the office. Is that a fair observation?
It's very fair. It's yeah. One always has the list of things one has to do at the start of the day, and one hopes by the end of the day one's done them. But there's always something different. I, I, I'm often asked that question. I was actually thinking about it in advance of this podcast. So obviously I can't divulge what I've been doing in terms of anything
Mm.
confidential. But earlier today I was on a call with a client dealing with a contentious data subject access request, and it was all talk about strategy and obviously about law, but it was all rather academic and theoretical. Whilst we were on the call, a letter of claim dropped into their mailbox, and suddenly the mind gets a bit more focused. Um, so, and then I was speaking to someone about a piece of litigation I'm involved in. I've just finished a lengthy note for a client on direct electronic marketing. But just before we came on, I get a message from one of the associates. Can we have an urgent call about the recording of a meeting? Um, some of those things I knew I was going to have. Some are just completely thrown at me. I find that fascinating, really stimulating, really rewarding. So yeah, no day is the same.
Not dissimilar in a way to being a subject matter expert in house. You just don't know what's going to come out of the woodwork each day, right? I mean, I get a sense with you that you enjoy that varied nature of the day job, and don't want to do a process job,
Yeah,
every
no,
day's the same kind
that's
of thing.
certainly true, and I guess it's an extra layer of diversity above an in-house job because you're working for a multiplicity of clients. So yes, certainly from in-house, you don't know what's going to hit you from one minute to the next, but you know whose interests you're working for. Uh, Whereas private practice, the range of clients, and again, I come back to Mishcon because it has I guess, a slightly unusually diverse client base. So we do a lot of private client work. So
Mm,
a lot of my peers in data protection who work in private practice will generally be working for data controllers for the
mm.
corporates. Whereas I can be on both sides. Um, and again, I find that really stimulating, but it's great for just improving your own knowledge and expertise.
Like it. You tell me a bit about the kind of the Twitter side of things. You were pretty successful on Twitter a while ago, weren't you? You grown something of a profile.
Yeah, um, I guess yeah, I'm sure. In fact, I know from conversations we've had. So, yeah, I think with a certain level of or a certain number of followers on social media, you tend to reach a sort of critical mass where you start to get criticism. Uh, you always have to measure your words, but I guess it's if you have a room full of people, there'll be one
Mm,
or two cantankerous people within the room, and the larger the room, the more cantankerous people there will be. And so, if you hit a certain mass of followers, then you may well come across an online cantankerous person. That can be quite tricky to manage, especially from a legal and reputational point. So yeah, occasionally you'd have run-ins. I've been fortunate to have employers who don't just tolerate my use of it, but actively encourage it. They recognise the benefit to me and to them.
And have you also had some success on the media side of things as well, like traditional media, either print or broadcast? If you has that spilled over into that? Do you get commented in the press on
Yeah,
things?
I do, and I'm Mishcon is never shy of commenting when it can on
Mm,
a matter or on a news item. So we're very responsive when journalists want comment, and I think I personally am very responsive. So yeah, I do get contacted quite often for generally on specialist matters, but often where
mm.
specialist matter that's suddenly got a more general significance. The journalist probably doesn't know that much, might want a call for background. I'm happy to do that normally. And then if there's a request for an actual comment on the record, then equally I will do. So yeah, I, despite how voluble I can be on something like this, I generally prefer to do stuff in writing just because I hate the sound of my voice and hate the look of my face. Uh, but yeah,
If you could choose a show to be on, though, which one would it be? Like which TV, radio, it doesn't matter.
well, in general, I think not
Yeah, ideally
particularly.
relating to your practice of law, not like I
Okay.
don't say I don't be Doc Martin or something. That's fine though.
Well, I I've always been a bit of a fan of quizzes. So I wonder if maybe going on mastermind and having information law or information rights law as a specialist subject, it would be the dullest round for most people, but for a certain subset, they would
They
get.
would be very happy. Okay, in fact, I know at least 3 or 4 people I've worked with in the past that would definitely tune in that week. So people who are now at Phil Fisher and Oswald Clark as well, they would love listening to you talk about that, I'm sure.
Well, and I should
Um,
say something because I think I fell into the trap there really of doing down my practice area and suggesting it's dull. And it isn't. Obviously, parts of every practice area are dull and technical. But this is something that really affects all of us.
mm,
You and I, Si, are data subjects. We
yeah.
we we have rights under data protection law. We have privacy rights. We interact with public authorities. We have an inherent right to information from public authorities. These are really important rights. And I think a lot of people see data protection in particular as some sort of dull compliance. Part of it is perhaps, but a lot of it is actually quite invigorating human rights stuff.
I mean, I remember the moment it changed for me in relation to privacy laws. I was watching Channel 4 News, would have been 2018, 2019. Facebook, I think the ICO must have tipped them off as to what they were going to do. It was to do with Cambridge Analytica. It was around that time that we're talking, wasn't it? And they literally had like news cameras down watching the ICO's people kind of go in to raid the offices. And I thought there aren't too many areas of law where, it's this kind of like public interest and they've actually worked with the journalists to kind of do it at the same time. And I agree with you. I think most areas are actually interesting when you get into it, but not every area of each of each practice area is interesting, as you say. It's just some of it's
Yeah.
standard. Um, uh, what was I going to ask you as well? What are the any trends on at the moment that you're thinking for the year ahead for 2025 for individuals or businesses? Anything that you would point to? It's going to be a big story next year.
Well, there are a few. I mean, you can't. What are we? 15 minutes into this, and we haven't mentioned AI yet. But here I go. Um, you know, I think we're only in the sort of foothills of development of artificial intelligence. Um, there are starting, as you'll know, there are already quite a lot of cases globally about AI and IP, and what we're starting to get are the AI and it's not so much privacy rights, it is more just pure data protection rights. So, questions around how are these large language models trained? What information was used to train them? And then also what happens with your information if it goes into one of the models? They're learning from the information. And then what about the output? What about the accuracy issues? Um, it's not a personal data point, but I tested ChatGPT this morning in response to a comment someone made on LinkedIn. I tested it on a recent case, actually about the Cambridge Analytica matter. Um, and it did quite a good summary of what was a complex judgment, but it then got the outcome completely the wrong way around. And that if you apply a sort of personal data aspect to that could be pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, I agree. I think most people have misconceived it as a search engine rather than something that is generative. I mean, it's there to make the best possibility guess on the basis of whatever it decides in its model. And I think, how can I put it best, John? I feel like it's like turning up to a rugby union match, having studied the rules of rugby league, and thinking that somehow you can win the match, right?
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
it's not going to go well for you if you do
yeah,
that, right? It's a
yeah.
complete game. It just has half the same name. Do you know what I mean?
Do you
So,
know what it reminded me of? Just very quick anecdote. I studied French A level,
right.
and the book I was given over one summer, I can't remember the name in French anymore, but it was the original book of The Bridge on the River Kwai. And I read most of it, and then the summer holidays came to an end and I hadn't finished. And when I gave my synopsis in class, I said, again, I'm not going to do the French. I said, and at the end, they succeed in blowing the bridge up. And my teacher at the time said, "Are you sure about that?" And sure enough, in the book, the bridge isn't destroyed. And it's almost that leap I made of I did a good summary and then I just made my best guess on what I'd been fed.
It's just a
Proto
perfect
AI.
metaphor. I'm going to remember that from now on. Like, don't assume that the outcome has got anything to do with the input or the summary bit as well.
Yeah.
Any advice that you've got for somebody, maybe somebody who's listening, who's thinking about getting into a career into privacy and data commercialization and that kind of area? Any advice for them?
I get this. I get asked this an awful lot. I think
Right.
because I'm a non-lawyer
Yeah.
working in a law firm, um, I do get asked it. Some of it is really obvious. Don't sort of stick a pin in a board and decide, well, that's the career for me. You've got to have some interest in it. But maybe we just presume that's the case. So I I'm a bit of an evangelist for the fact that this is about the law, and as much as guidance is great and practice is great, and uh, learning or remembering things from what someone else used to do, and ultimately it's underpinned by law. And you can't get away from that. I go back to when I was faced with learning about the Freedom of Information Act. I read the act, and people need to know what the law says. And that's both in terms of the statute, but also common law. I find reading judgments, commenting on judgments, um, tremendously educative. Not everyone agrees with me. A lot of people say, you're just going to drive people off. I can't think of a better way of learning really than reading judgments, going back, looking at some of the landmark judgments. Um, so, and I think a follow-on question is often, well, do you need to be legally qualified? And I'm not. So the answer must be no. Um, does it help? I think it probably does. There are obviously areas of the law I don't know about, and I obviously can't and wouldn't advise on. But I do find occasionally I'm hampered by not having the full legal education that a solicitor would have had. So there might be aspects, I don't know, let's say of company law, that I have to really check with colleagues before I can fully understand how that relates to a data protection issue that I'm advising on. So you don't have to be a lawyer, but I think it does help. There are some things that lawyers tend to do that non-lawyers don't, which there might be benefit in not being qualified, but I think on balance, it I would advocate it.
Have you ever thought about getting a bit closer to the policy side of things as well? Did you ever get involved in any, discussions at Westminster, or would you want to appear on a kind of select committee if they were doing a roundup of kind of experts as to how to forge forward?
I'd, I have more on the freedom of information side
Right.
actually, and I'm I guess I'm always maybe I'm just indecisive, but I'm rarely utterly convinced of one point of view over another, and I'm not sure that's necessarily helpful for policymakers when they're being advised, because I will always think, well, there's another side to this. So I'm certainly not averse to it, but I guess also being in a client-facing role, and again going back to my point about diversity of clients, I've got to be mindful that I'm not potentially saying anything that might have an adverse effect on a client or a
Of course.
subset of clients. And I'll add to that. So I chair this organisation called NADPO, the
Mm,
National Association of Data Protection and Freedom of Information Officers.
mm.
And quite often I'm asked in that chair role, does NADPO intend to lobby for X or oppose Y? And the answer's rarely, because we have a very diverse membership. So, I don't want to be purporting to represent a membership where in fact I might be saying something that some of those members disagree with. So
Mm.
that almost encapsulates how my mind works anyway, that I'm reluctant to lean too heavily on one side against another.
What I just heard was that you're more interested in framing the debate and listening to what those various different opinions and arguments may be, representing the views of that body. I was going to ask you what you'd learned from that role. Was there anything above and beyond maybe the need not to represent just one view as one of them? But
I think that's one of the main ones, really.
Mhm.
When I took over as chair of NAPO, which was, let's say, 10 years ago. I think it was probably more. We were down. You could almost count the number of members on or two hands, perhaps. Um, we're now in the hundreds,
Right.
um, and with that comes responsibility, and that is responsibility to, just financial, if you like, fiduciary sort of responsibility to run the organisation properly, but also a kind of responsibility to represent it in the best way and represent the members in the best way. But I guess I've also learned that there is a real um, desire for people practicing in my area to come together, formally as an organisation, but also just to get together in terms of networks. So, like, obviously COVID hit everyone in the same way or in multiple different ways, but we went completely online during COVID, and we're still mostly online,
Mm.
NAPO, and I'm very keen to find the best way of breaking out of that and getting back to old world networking, because I think people really need it, really benefit from it.
I like that. We've seen a huge shift over the last years towards wealthy individuals having like family offices, having setups that are kind of almost like corporate in structure, but looking after individual. Can you see can you see a role at some point where people may end up being a chief people officer, but for a family office, as in they would go and work, on that side of things, half reputation, half PR, half privacy, if that stacks up.
I'm sure. I mean, I suspect it's already happening.
Right.
We do quite a lot of private office work, and I do get involved in quite a lot of advice. There's all sorts of stuff, but even just employment issues. For private office work, that weird interface between private and corporate. And so, people employed will often be employed within a home, and then you've got issues around monitoring of employees within a home and CCTV, and so I'm sure that's the case. I maybe not a dedicated role. You'll often find that within small companies, which is what we're talking about, really. It's more that the general counsel will have to have it as a string to his or her bow,
Yeah.
rather than necessarily you'd employ a bespoke data protection person.
Guess that takes us on to the next question, which is, I mean, it's quite a technical area, maybe more so than some of the other areas, as it were, and it seems, yeah, quite compliance driven at times as well. So how do you make sure that people keep that kind of human element in there as well when they're doing their thinking around data protection? What do you do? I mean, I know that you're not a qualified lawyer, and I'm wondering if that's part of the success of it, but I don't know. What do you think?
Maybe. I mean, I've done a little bit of it on this podcast by reminding us, you and me, that we are data subjects, that we have these rights. We have personal data that needs protecting. Um, I encourage people to exercise those rights as well. Not for the sake of it. So I wouldn't say just make a data subject access request because it's fun, because it's actually quite onerous on the recipient. But in the appropriate case, to make it, and equally to make freedom of information requests. These are human and civic rights, and I guess that's what I mean. That if I succeed in framing a discussion in such a way that people understand it's not just paperwork and compliance, it's actually real life, then I think I'm succeeding.
I love that as an answer. Um, Final question. Anything that you can tell us, like a kooky or a quirky fact about data protection as an area of law, or something you wish that more people knew?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it was over the weekend I was thinking about this. Have you heard of the David Meyer question in terms of ChatGPT, OpenAI?
Mhm.
So some researchers or journalists, I'm not sure, discovered that if you asked ChatGPT about David Meyer, Mayer, it wouldn't answer. And as much as you probed it, it seemed to clam up even more. Now, what people are surmising is that someone called David Meyer has made a right to be forgotten request to OpenAI. And so they have suppressed any reference to the words David Meyer. Now, that's interesting. Apparently, there are some other names that it works with. But it occurred to me that if a certain number of people, I don't know who, and with a certain number of names made a right to be forgotten request to OpenAI, it could collapse the whole thing because suddenly ChatGPT would struggle to say anything about anyone. Now, uh, law of unintended consequences. The point I made in the post on LinkedIn was, I know I'm not the worst vanity searcher on Google, but I probably have done it too often, and I know that there is a company called Jon Baines Travel. Now, if I got OpenAI to suppress all mention of Jon Baines, that would have potentially a real effect on how ChatGPT dealt with Jon Baines Travel. And there's a marine biologist called Jon Baines, so I'd probably affect his research publications. And I shouldn't be able to. And for me, this becomes really interesting because then I come to the formulation that the words Jon Baines are not my personal data because they need context to make them my personal data. So a name on its own, because it can be shared, is not relating to an single identified or identifiable individual. So I move from the David Meyer conundrum, if you like, to as I say, a proposition that Jon Baines is not personal data. Now I'm being playful, really, but
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's something that technology companies are going to have to grapple with is how they respond to requests like that.
Yeah, I
The
mean,
law of unintended consequence.
and Google had to grapple with it a few years ago. I think that because they went to, when they were doing the Freebase, I think it was called the database, when they look at it, they turned to Wiki to basically get the answers to what constituted an entity. So who is Jon Baines, who is Simon Marshall? Not Simon Marshall, the cabinet maker, not Simon Marshall, the Australian jockey, but Simon Marshall, the LinkedIn whatever, right? That guy, legal marketer, right? Wikipedia is the best version that the world had of what these entities were, and actually had a very good IA before AI kind of approach. Right, we knew how to file things because Wikipedia had done it for all these years as well. So I think that bringing that level of consistency to the AI world is going to be very interesting as to what
Yeah.
happens next as well. I think it's been incredibly useful playing with it so far, but I think it's going to get more useful as the years go by as well. That's my
And it's going to face some real litigation challenges, I think. Maybe not in the UK, where the market for class data litigation is not particularly buoyant. Maybe not Europe, certainly in the US though. And it's one of those areas I really struggle to predict how it will develop because the technology is developing at such a pace at the same time that yeah, it's anyone's guess.
We'll be here to watch it. I'm sure you'll be here to watch it, anyway, John, and advising people as it does so. Listen, thank you so much for your time today. If people don't already follow you on LinkedIn, I'd warmly recommend it, or on X. But I think definitely on LinkedIn, just to make sure that they understand what you're talking about professionally as well there, I think would be a good idea. John is one of the most successful people in the LinkedIn influencers list. He's regularly ranked up there, so do take a look. And if you've enjoyed this edition, this episode, and you think that somebody would enjoy it, then send it on to them. If you think somebody might be inspired to be a data protection, data commercialization, whatever you want to call them, expert, then forward it on to them. Right? I think that's the idea of the
Yeah,
podcast, is to bring new subject matters to people's heart. John, you're always a star, and I've really appreciated your time today. So thank you.
absolute pleasure. Thanks, sir.